The Unspoken Silence, Chapter 1, The Echoes of Cedar Creek High. The invitation lay on Evelyn Reed's antique mahogany desk, a glossy cardstock rectangle adorned with the familiar, if slightly faded, emblem of Cedar Creek High School. Class of 1975, 50th Reunion, it proclaimed in elegant gold script. Evelyn, at 68, ran a successful literary agency from her serene brownstone in Portland, Oregon, a life meticulously built on words, contracts, and the careful curation of stories. But this invitation, this was a story she had long tried to rewrite, or perhaps simply forget. Cedar Creek, Ohio, a small town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, where cornfields stretched to the horizon and gossip traveled faster than the morning dew. Evelyn had left it in her rearview mirror the day after graduation, a scholarship to Northwestern University clutched in her hand, and a burning desire to escape the suffocating weight of its small-town judgments. She had rarely looked back, except, of course, for Mark Jensen. His name, even after 5 decades, could still conjure a bittersweet ache in her chest. Her high school sweetheart, the star quarterback, with a laugh that crinkled his eyes and a future as bright as the Ohio sun. They had been inseparable, the golden couple of Cedar Creek High. Everyone expected them to marry, to build their life right there, surrounded by white picket fences and Sunday church services. But then, on the eve of graduation, he had disappeared, vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, just a deafening silence. Her heart had shattered. The town had whispered. Some said he ran off with another girl. Others, more maliciously, suggested he'd gotten cold feet. Evelyn had absorbed the judgment, the pity, the subtle accusations from well-meaning neighbors who thought she must have done something to drive him away. She had carried that silent shame, that public heartbreak, like a brand. It was the primary reason she fled Cedar Creek and never returned, not even for her parents' funerals, opting instead to grieve privately, from a distance, unwilling to face the ghosts. Now, 50 years later, the invitation. A part of her, the hardened, pragmatic part, scoffed at the idea. Why revisit a past that had caused so much pain? But another part, a small, persistent whisper, felt a pull, a longing for answers, a flicker of hope, however irrational, that perhaps, just perhaps, she might finally understand. She scrolled through the reunion website, familiar names, some with photos, some without. A list of attendees was growing. She scrolled past dozens, her fingers hovering, and then she saw it. Mark Jensen, listed as attending. Her breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. Mark was gone. He had to be. Hadn't she grieved him for half a century? Hadn't she accepted his disappearance as a brutal, unexplained ending? The name, a cruel mirage, must be a mistake. A different Mark Jensen. There could be no other explanation. Yet a frantic hope, thin and fragile as a spiderweb, began to stretch across the vast emptiness of her heart. What if it was him? What if he was alive? And if so, why had he disappeared? Why the silence? Why the sudden reappearance now? The questions, long dormant, now roared to life, demanding answers. The invitation was no longer just a piece of cardstock. It was a lifeline, a challenge, a promise of a revelation she both yearned for and dreaded. She booked her flight to Ohio. The echoes of Cedar Creek High were calling her back. And this time, Evelyn was determined to listen, no matter how painful the melody. Chapter 2: The Ghosts in the Ballroom. The Cedar Creek Community Center ballroom hummed with a cacophony of cheerful chatter, classic rock hits from the 70s, and the clinking of glasses. Balloons in the school colors of green and gold bobbed above tables laden with nostalgic foods. Evelyn, dressed in an elegant emerald green gown, stood at the entrance, a polite smile plastered on her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 50 years, half a century. Faces, once vibrant with youthful energy, were now etched with the lines of age, softened by time or hardened by life's trials. Some were instantly recognizable, others a bewildering blur. She felt like an anthropologist observing a tribe she once belonged to. Now an outsider looking in. "Evelyn Reed? Is that really you?" A familiar voice, warm and effusive. It was Carol Miller, her former best friend, now a woman with a kind, crinkled face and a cascade of silver hair. A wave of unexpected emotion washed over Evelyn. Carol. The last time they spoke, it was through a veil of tears. A hurried phone call from Boston just weeks after graduation. "Oh, Carol," Evelyn murmured, embracing her fiercely. The years melted away briefly. They talked, catching up on decades of life, careers, families, triumphs, and losses. But the elephant in the room remained unspoken. Mark. Evelyn waited, her nerves taut, for Carol to mention his name, to explain his presence on the attendance list. But Carol skirted around it, her eyes darting away whenever Evelyn's gaze lingered too long. "So, Mark Jensen is here?" Evelyn finally asked, her voice deliberately casual but a tremor betraying her composure. Carol's smile faltered. Her gaze flickered to the other side of the room, to a group of men laughing boisterously. "Oh, yes, he is." Her tone was oddly neutral, almost guarded. Evelyn's breath hitched. He was here, the real Mark. Her heart leaped, then plunged. She scanned the room, her eyes darting, searching. And then she saw him, standing by the punch bowl, a glass in his hand, talking animatedly with a small group of former football teammates. Mark. Older, of course, his dark hair threaded with silver. His lean frame a little softer, but the broad shoulders, the way he tilted his head when he laughed. It was him, her Mark. Their eyes met across the crowded room. His laughter died. His gaze, once so full of warmth and adoration, now held a strange mixture of recognition, regret, and something else, something akin to fear or shame. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He just stared, a ghost suddenly made flesh. A wave of dizziness washed over Evelyn. She felt the urge to rush to him, to demand answers, to shake him until he explained. But something held her back. The guarded looks from Carol, Mark's own conflicted expression. It wasn't the reunion she had imagined. It wasn't the joyous, tearful embrace she had, deep down, foolishly hoped for. "I need a moment," Evelyn murmured to Carol, excusing herself. She retreated to the ladies' room, her hands clammy, her mind reeling. He was here. He was real. But the silence, the long, unbearable silence of 45 years, still hung between them, thick and palpable. And it was clear that she wasn't the only one guarding a secret. The entire class of Cedar Creek High, it seemed, was holding its breath. And the air was heavy with an unspoken truth. Chapter 3: The Conspiracy of Silence. Evelyn avoided Mark for the rest of the evening. It was a cowardly act, she knew, but she needed time to compose herself, to understand the strange, unsettling dynamic that now permeated the reunion. Every time she caught a glimpse of Mark, he seemed to avert his gaze or quickly turn away. He wasn't avoiding just her, it seemed. He was avoiding everyone, maintaining a perimeter of distance, a quiet, almost haunted presence. She tried to engage with other classmates. The conversations were superficial, filled with pleasantries and cautious reminiscences. But whenever Mark's name came up, or when Evelyn subtly tried to steer the conversation towards his disappearance, the atmosphere shifted. Smiles would falter, eyes would dart, and the topic would be swiftly changed. It was a palpable conspiracy of silence, a collective agreement to dance around a central, unspoken truth. Even Carol, her oldest friend, remained stubbornly evasive. "Evelyn, darling, let's just enjoy the evening," she had said, patting Evelyn's hand with a forced cheerfulness. So much has changed, so much time has passed. But time, Evelyn knew, didn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it merely entombed them, waiting for the right moment to crack open and reveal what lay beneath. She watched Mark from across the room. He seemed isolated, despite being surrounded by people. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond mere aging. He looked like a man carrying an immense burden, one that had weighed him down for decades. As the evening wound down, Evelyn decided she couldn't leave Cedar Creek without answers. She had to break this wall of silence. She had flown across the country for this, for a chance to finally understand. She approached Mark as he stood alone near the exit, seemingly preparing to leave. Her heart throbbed. "Mark," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He flinched, as if struck. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and resignation. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice raspy, a ghost of the vibrant laugh she remembered. I didn't think you'd come." "Why wouldn't I?" she challenged, her voice low. "After 50 years of silence, of wondering, of believing you left me, of believing you were dead for all I knew." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. He closed his eyes for a moment, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. So very sorry. I know I owe you an explanation. More than an explanation." "Yes, you do," she insisted. "But it's not just me, is it? Everyone here seems to know something about why you disappeared, something they've all been keeping from me. All these years." She gestured around the thinning crowd. "It feels like a secret club, Mark, and I was the only one not invited." He opened his eyes, and the profound sadness she had observed earlier seemed to deepen. "It's complicated, Evelyn. More complicated than you can imagine." He looked around, as if searching for eavesdroppers. "This isn't the place, not here." "Then where?" she pressed. "Because I'm not leaving Cedar Creek until I know the truth, Mark. Not this time." He hesitated, then sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound. "My place, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I live in the old Miller farm, just outside town. You remember the road? The one with the big oak tree?" Evelyn remembered. It was the road they used to drive down, windows open, music blaring, on their way to the hidden swimming hole, a place of carefree joy, now haunted by untold secrets. "I'll be there," she said, her voice firm. There was a quiet resolve in her eyes that brooked no argument. Mark nodded, a defeated look on his face, and then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the cool Ohio night. Evelyn stood there, amidst the lingering echoes of the reunion, the half-eaten cake, the deflated balloons. The conspiracy of silence was about to break, and she had a terrifying premonition that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be far more devastating than any abandonment she had ever imagined. The ghosts in the ballroom were finally ready to tell their tale. Chapter 4: The Unburdening of Mark. The old Miller farm was exactly as Evelyn remembered it. A sprawling white farmhouse, weathered by time, surrounded by fields stretching endlessly under the vast Ohio sky. The venerable oak tree, now even larger, stood sentinel by the driveway. Evelyn arrived promptly at 9 a.m., her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. Mark opened the door. He looked older, more tired in the harsh morning light than he had under the ballroom's dimmed illumination. His eyes, however, held a new, quiet determination. He led her into a cozy, albeit somewhat cluttered, living room. The scent of old wood and brewing coffee filled the air. "Coffee?" he offered, his voice still a little raspy. "Please," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. She sat on an old, worn armchair, her gaze fixed on him. He poured 2 mugs, his hands trembling slightly, and handed one to her. He then sat opposite her, his gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. "Mark," Evelyn finally prompted, "start from the beginning. Everything. Why did you disappear? Why the silence? Why did no one, not even Carol, tell me anything?" He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. "It's a long story, Evelyn, and it's not a pretty one, but you deserve to know. You always deserve to know." He finally met her eyes, and the raw pain in his gaze made her flinch. "The night before graduation," he began, his voice low. "A night we were supposed to meet by the creek. I didn't come because I was with my father. He had been acting strange for weeks, agitated, withdrawn. He had secrets, Evelyn. Dark secrets." Mark paused, his gaze drifting to the window, as if seeing ghosts in the fields. "My father, Robert Jensen, was not the pillar of the community everyone thought he was. He was involved in unsavory dealings. Not just local corruption, but something far more serious. He had gotten involved with a crime syndicate, a very dangerous group from out of state, connected to organized crime. He owed them money, a lot of money, more than he could ever repay." Evelyn gasped. Robert Jensen, the respected town banker? This was unthinkable. "He was desperate," Mark continued, his voice heavy with shame. "He had lost everything gambling, making bad investments, trying to get ahead. He was being threatened. And they had a proposition for him, a way to clear his debt. But it involved me." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "They wanted me, Evelyn. Not for violence, for information. They had learned about my football scholarship to State University. They wanted me to go, to play, to gain influence, to report on certain dealings that were going on in the athletic department, specifically related to sports betting and recruitment fraud. They needed an insider. And if I refused, they threatened my family, my mother, my younger sister. They swore they would hurt them. And they had a reputation for making good on their threats." Evelyn felt a wave of cold dread. "They threatened your family to make you an informant?" "Yes," he confirmed, his voice breaking. "My father begged me. He said it was the only way to save them, to save him. He was terrified. I was terrified. What choice did I have? I was 18. I knew nothing about that world. But I knew I couldn't let my family be hurt." "So you left? You ran away with them?" "Not exactly. They arranged my disappearance. It had to look like I abandoned everyone, that I ran away on my own accord. That way, no one would suspect I was forced into anything. It was a cover, a deep cover. I was to cut off all ties. No calls, no letters, no contact with anyone from Cedar Creek. Especially you. He looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. They knew about us, Evelyn. They knew we were inseparable. They used that against me. They said if I tried to contact you, if I tried to explain, they would hurt you. They would make sure you suffered. You were my greatest vulnerability. So I had to make it look like I didn't care, that I just left. The alternative was unthinkable. Evelyn sat, stunned. The cruel, senseless abandonment she had carried for 50 years was a meticulously crafted lie, designed to protect her. A lie that had shattered her life. And Carol, Evelyn finally managed. And the others, the class, they knew? Not everything, Mark admitted, only a select few. My father, in his desperation, confessed fragments to a few trusted parents, the parents of my closest friends. He begged them to help him protect his family, to keep the secret. They were horrified, but they understood the threat. They agreed to keep silent for my family's safety. They told their kids just enough to make sure they wouldn't press. They told them I had gotten into serious trouble, that I had to leave town quickly, that I was involved in something very dangerous, and that they had to protect me and my family by keeping quiet, especially from you. They knew how much you loved me, and how much danger you'd be in if you knew the truth and tried to find me. Evelyn felt a surge of conflicting emotions, fury at the deceit, sorrow for Mark's impossible choice, and a chilling understanding of the fear that must have gripped her entire town. The conspiracy of silence wasn't born of malice, but of terror. Her class, her friends, had been sworn to a devastating secret, protecting her by breaking her heart. The unburdening of Mark had begun, but the true weight of the hidden truth was only just starting to reveal itself. Chapter 5. A Life Lived in Shadow. Mark continued, his voice a low, steady drone, punctuated by the occasional tremor of raw emotion. Evelyn listened, her mind struggling to reconcile the idyllic memories of her youth with the grim reality he was unveiling. I went to State University, he recounted. I played football. I graduated. I learned things I never wanted to know. I reported back to them, to the syndicate. It was a hellish existence, living a double life, always looking over my shoulder. They kept me on a tight leash, constantly reminding me of the threats against my family. I was their puppet, their pawn. But eventually, Evelyn pressed, you must have found a way out. He nodded, a weary sigh escaping his lips. It took years, nearly 2 decades. I meticulously gathered evidence, not just against their sports betting operations, but against their entire network, their money laundering, their extortion, even some disappearances. I became good at it, Evelyn, too good. I learned how they operated, how to get information, how to stay hidden. You were a spy, she whispered, her voice filled with awe and horror. A reluctant one, he corrected. I worked my way up their ranks, gaining trust, becoming indispensable, all while building my case, piece by piece, against them. It was a dangerous game. One wrong move, and I was dead. Or worse, my family would pay the price. What happened? In the late 90s, I finally had enough. I approached the FBI. It was a high-stakes gamble. They knew who I was. They knew my reputation. But the evidence I presented was undeniable. It led to a massive sting operation. Dozens of arrests. The entire syndicate was brought down. It was a landmark case. And your family? They were safe. The FBI provided them with protection, new identities. They moved out of Cedar Creek. No one from the syndicate could ever find them. My father, he died a few years later. He carried the guilt of putting me in that situation until his last breath. My mother and sister were still alive, living quiet lives under new names. I visit them occasionally, under strict protocols. And you? Evelyn asked. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you find me? His gaze met hers, filled with an anguish that mirrored her own. After the bust, I was placed in witness protection. My life was too valuable, my knowledge too dangerous. They changed my name, gave me a new history. They told me I could never return to my old life. Never contact anyone from my past. It was part of the deal. My testimony was crucial. My anonymity was their priority. But they could have told me, she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. Even a coded message, something, anything to let me know you were alive, that you hadn't abandoned me. I tried, Evelyn, he said, his voice raw with regret. God, I tried. I begged the FBI to let me send you a message, a single word. They refused, said it was too risky, said it would compromise my new identity, put you in danger. They were ruthless. They had to be. My life and the safety of my family depended on it. He paused, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. I watched your life from afar, Evelyn. Through old newspapers, through online searches, I saw you leave Cedar Creek, build your agency, become a success. It broke my heart every single day, knowing the pain I caused you, knowing you probably hated me, but I had to let you go. It was the only way to keep you safe. The weight of his words pressed down on Evelyn. A life lived in shadow, not of his choosing, but forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. Her abandonment, her heartbreak, was a cruel, necessary sacrifice. And now, she asked, her voice trembling, why are you here now, at the reunion? My term in witness protection officially ended last year, Mark explained. The remaining members of the syndicate are either dead or in prison for life. The threat is gone. My identity is no longer at risk. And I just wanted to come back, to see Cedar Creek again, to see if I could find some peace. And perhaps to finally explain to you, if you were ever here. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. I know it doesn't make up for 50 years of silence, Evelyn. I know. But I needed you to know. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Evelyn stared at him, tears streaming down her face, tears of sorrow, of relief, of a profound, aching understanding. The ghost of abandonment had finally been laid to rest, replaced by a ghost of sacrifice. Mark hadn't abandoned her. He had protected her at the cost of his own life, his own identity. His life lived in shadow had finally come to light, illuminating the depth of a love that had endured through the darkest of times. Chapter 6, The Confession of Carol. After Mark's heartbreaking confession, Evelyn spent the rest of the day with him, listening to the full, harrowing details of his life in witness protection. He recounted near misses, close calls, the constant paranoia, and the profound loneliness of living a lie. Evelyn, in turn, shared the story of her own life, the pain of his disappearance, her escape to Portland, her career, her solitary existence, always carrying the weight of his unexplained absence. They sat for hours, bridging a 50-year chasm of silence, with words, tears, and the rediscovery of a connection that had never truly died. That evening, Evelyn knew she couldn't leave Cedar Creek without confronting Carol and the others. She understood why they had kept the secret, but the weight of that silence, the collective deception, still stung. She called Carol, asking to meet. Carol, sensing the shift, agreed immediately. They met at a quiet diner, the same one they used to frequent in high school. Carol looked nervous, her gaze avoiding Evelyn's. "Carol," Evelyn began, her voice calm but firm. "I saw Mark today. He told me everything." Carol flinched, her shoulders slumped. "Oh, Evelyn," she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "I am so sorry. I wanted to tell you so many times, every single day for 50 years. I thought about it, but I couldn't." "Why?" Evelyn asked, not with anger, but with a deep, aching need for understanding. "My parents," Carol explained, her voice cracking. "They were very close to Robert Jensen, Mark's father. He came to them the day after Mark disappeared. He was a broken man, terrified. He confessed everything. He told them about the syndicate, about the threats, about how Mark was forced to leave to protect them all. He begged us to keep it quiet. He swore us to secrecy, for Mark's safety, for his family's safety, and for your safety, Evelyn." Carol wiped a tear from her cheek. "They told me just enough. They said Mark was in grave danger, involved with very bad people, and if anyone, especially you, tried to find him or expose anything, you would be harmed. They told me that by letting you believe he had just abandoned you, by letting you leave Cedar Creek, they were protecting you. It was a terrible choice, Evelyn. A truly terrible choice. We all hated it. But what could we do? We were scared. Scared for Mark. Scared for his family. Scared for you." Evelyn remembered the whispers, the rumors, the pitying glances. Now it all made a terrible, heartbreaking sense. The town wasn't judging her. They were protecting her in the only way they knew how, by participating in a silent, collective sacrifice. "And the others?" Evelyn pressed. "Who else knew?" Carol listed a handful of names. Mike, the football captain, Susan, the head cheerleader, David, the class valedictorian. Their parents were all approached by Robert Jensen. They all agreed to keep the secret. We all swore oaths. We all carried it. Why didn't you tell me, even after he was in witness protection, even after the syndicate was busted? "Because we didn't know about witness protection, Evelyn," Carol said, shaking her head. "We only knew he had been forced to disappear. We thought he was still in danger. We heard rumors, fragments. We never knew the full extent of it. And then, years later, when some of us found out about the FBI bust, we thought it meant he was finally safe, but we also assumed he wanted to remain anonymous, that his new life was permanent. We never knew he planned to come back, or that he was waiting for the right moment. We thought he was gone forever, and that the secret had to die with us. The weight of the decades-long secret, the shared burden, the profound fear that had driven their silence, settled over Evelyn. It wasn't malice. It was misguided protection, born of fear and a desperate attempt to safeguard those they cared about. Evelyn reached across the table and took Carol's hand. "I understand," she said, her voice soft, filled with a new kind of sorrow and a profound, unexpected forgiveness. "I understand now. It was never about me. It was about all of you, caught in an impossible situation." Tears streamed down Carol's face. "Oh, Evie," she cried, using the old nickname. "I'm so sorry. I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped feeling guilty." Evelyn squeezed her hand. "It's over now, Carol. The secret is out, and we can finally grieve together." The confession of Carol had laid bare the collective burden of their class, a truth that, while painful, was finally, profoundly liberating. The long-held silence of Cedar Creek High was finally broken. Chapter 7, Rebuilding Bridges, Forgiving the Past. The morning after Carol's confession, Evelyn felt a profound sense of lightness, a shedding of decades of emotional weight. The pain of abandonment had been replaced by the quiet understanding of sacrifice and fear. While the revelation was heartbreaking, it was also liberating. The air in Cedar Creek felt clearer, less oppressive. She met with Mark again. This time, their conversation flowed with a new ease, tinged with a shared melancholy, but also a burgeoning sense of hope. They walked through the familiar streets of Cedar Creek, revisiting old haunts, the ice cream parlor where they'd shared milkshakes, the old movie theater, now boarded up, the park bench where they'd carved their initials. Each place held a dual memory, the joyful past they shared, and the shadow of the secret that had torn them apart. Mark told her about his life in witness protection, the different cities he lived in, the various identities he assumed, the constant vigilance. He had become an expert in security systems. Ironically, using his skills to protect himself and others. His life, though solitary, had been one of constant purpose, driven by the need to stay hidden until the syndicate was truly neutralized. "I always pictured you, Evelyn," he confessed as they stood by the creek, "building a beautiful life, surrounded by love. I prayed you found happiness." "I built a life," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "A successful one. But there was always a missing piece, a mark-shaped hole in my heart. And now I know why." They spoke of their futures. Both had lived largely solitary lives, shaped by the trauma of his disappearance. Could they, after 50 years, find a way back to each other? The question hung unspoken, a fragile possibility. The Mark of her youth, the golden boy, was gone. But the man before her, forged in the crucible of unimaginable sacrifice, was someone new, someone profound. Evelyn decided to stay in Cedar Creek for a few more days. She met with the other classmates who had known the secret: Mike, Susan, David. Their faces were etched with relief and a deep apology. They spoke of the guilt they carried, the fear that had bound them, the anguish of seeing Evelyn suffer while being unable to offer comfort or truth. Evelyn, having heard Mark's full story, found it in her heart to offer them genuine forgiveness. It wasn't an easy thing, but understanding the weight of their impossible choice brought a powerful empathy. "We thought we were protecting you, Evie," Susan said, tears in her eyes. "It was the hardest thing we ever had to do." "I know," Evelyn replied, hugging her old friend tightly. "And I'm grateful, in a strange way. You kept me safe." The town, once a symbol of her heartbreak, began to transform into a place of profound healing. She visited her parents' graves, a ritual she had always avoided, and finally wept, not just for them, but for the lost years, for the truth unspoken, for the life that might have been. But these tears were cleansing, not bitter. Mark suggested they drive to his old home, the one he had grown up in. It was now owned by a young family, but the old house stood as a silent witness to a life violently upended. He showed her the back room where his father had confessed, the quiet desperation etched into his memory. The reunion wasn't just about rekindling old friendships. It was about tearing down the walls of silence that had shaped an entire generation of Cedar Creek residents. The story of Mark Jensen, the local hero turned reluctant spy, began to ripple through the town. Sympathy and understanding replaced the old whispers. As the days passed, a quiet, almost tentative connection began to reemerge between Evelyn and Mark. They weren't teenagers anymore, filled with impulsive passion. They were two older souls, scarred by life, but united by a love that had defied time and deception. They spent hours simply talking, sharing the stories of their separate lives, finding solace in each other's presence. One evening, sitting on his porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Mark took her hand. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft, "I know we can't go back, but perhaps we can move forward, together. if you'd have me." Evelyn looked at him, his silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight, his eyes filled with a vulnerable hope. Her heart, once so carefully guarded, swelled with an emotion she thought was long dead. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Yes, yes, I would. Rebuilding bridges, forgiving the past. It was a monumental task, but it was a journey they were finally ready to embark on, hand in hand." The unspoken silence had finally been broken, and in its place, a quiet, fragile promise of a shared future began to bloom. Chapter 8: A Future Rediscovered. Evelyn decided to extend her stay in Cedar Creek indefinitely. Her literary agency, mostly digital now, could be managed from anywhere. The pull of her old home, now redefined by understanding and forgiveness, was stronger than the comfort of her familiar routine in Portland. Mark, too, had no immediate plans to leave. The farm, once a refuge in his solitary life, now felt like a place of potential, a canvas for a new beginning. Their reconnection wasn't a sudden burst of youthful romance, but a slow, tender unfolding. They spent their days rediscovering the quiet rhythms of Cedar Creek, taking long walks through the autumn-tinged forests, sharing meals, and simply enjoying each other's company. They talked endlessly, filling in the gaps of 50 years, sharing triumphs and regrets, laughter and tears. Mark recounted his perilous life in witness protection with a detached calm, while Evelyn spoke of her career, her love for literature, and the void his absence had left. The town, initially hesitant, began to welcome them back. The story of Mark's disappearance and Evelyn's relentless search, now openly discussed, spread throughout Cedar Creek. Sympathy and awe replaced the old gossip. People understood the impossible burden the class had carried, and they marveled at the resilience of Evelyn and Mark. Old friendships were rekindled, now unburdened by secrets. Carol became Evelyn's confidant once more, their bond strengthened by the honesty that had finally emerged. One crisp afternoon, Evelyn and Mark returned to their spot by the Willow Creek. The leaves were turning to fiery reds and golds, reflecting in the clear water. They sat on the same moss-covered rocks where they had once carved their initials, now barely visible beneath layers of growth. "It feels like coming home," Evelyn mused, leaning her head on Mark's shoulder. "It is," he replied, his voice soft. "It always was. I just couldn't be here." They talked about their future. It wasn't a future of grand plans, but of quiet companionship. Mark offered to sell the farm and move to Portland, or for Evelyn to stay in Cedar Creek. But Evelyn, surprisingly, found herself drawn to the familiar comfort of the Ohio countryside, a place she had once vowed to escape. The town now felt different, redeemed. "I think," Evelyn said, looking up at him, "I'd like to stay, for a while, maybe for good." A smile, free of the shadow that had haunted him for decades, spread across Mark's face. "I'd like that very much, Evelyn. Very much indeed." They found a shared purpose in their newfound connection. Mark, with his newfound freedom, started volunteering at a local youth mentorship program, sharing his experiences of overcoming adversity. Evelyn, inspired by their story, began to consider writing a memoir, a story of love, loss, secrets, and the enduring power of truth. Their lives, once so separate and solitary, began to intertwine, weaving a new tapestry of shared experiences. The class of 1975, now free of their decades-long burden, planned smaller, more intimate gatherings. They spoke of the secret openly, sharing their own burdens, finding collective healing in the shared truth. The conspiracy of silence was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community and forgiveness. Evelyn and Mark never spoke of marriage. Their bond was deeper than ceremony, forged in the fires of shared pain and rediscovered love. They were two souls who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. Their love story, a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the profound impact of secrets. As winter approached, blanketing Cedar Creek in a soft, white silence, Evelyn and Mark sat by the fireplace in the old farmhouse. Evelyn held his hand, tracing the lines of his aged fingers. His life, once lived in shadow, was now bathed in the warm glow of genuine connection. Her heart, once shattered and sealed, was now, finally, truly open. The reunion of the Cedar Creek High class of 1975 had been more than just a gathering of old friends. It was a catalyst for truth, a path to forgiveness, and a bridge to a future that had been lost for half a century. Evelyn Reed, the woman who had fled Cedar Creek, had returned, not to a past she dreaded, but to a rediscovered future, filled with the quiet peace of a love that had defied every unspoken silence.